Welcome back to another long-form exploration of horror gaming. Tonight we're returning to where it all began, not just for a legendary franchise, but for an entire philosophy of what horror games could be. We're talking about Silent Hill, the 1999 PlayStation game that arrived quietly into a marketplace dominated by Resident Evil's visceral scares and forever changed what players expected from psychological horror. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's take a comprehensive journey through the fog-shrouded streets of a game that proved nightmares don't need to be loud to be devastating. The world before Silent Hill. To understand what Silent Hill accomplished, we need to understand the landscape it entered. January 1999 was a specific moment in gaming history. The PlayStation had been on the market for over 4 years in North America, and developers had finally mastered the hardware's quirks and capabilities. The survival horror genre, while not new, had found its definitive voice 3 years earlier with Capcom's Resident Evil in 1996. That game had established conventions that seemed unshakable, pre-rendered backgrounds that looked like fixed camera shots from a film, controls that made your character feel weighty and vulnerable, resource management that created constant tension around ammunition and healing items, and a particular brand of horror that borrowed heavily from George Romero's zombie films and the creature features of the 1980s horror cinema. Resident Evil was scary, undoubtedly. The dogs crashing through the windows in the mansion's hallway became instantly iconic. The first zombie encounter in the dining room, turning slowly to reveal its grotesque face, was nightmare fuel for countless players. But Resident Evil's horror was immediate and biological. You could see the threat. You understood the rules. Zombies moved slowly, but could take significant damage. You learned their patterns, mastered the dodge timing, optimized your resource usage. With enough skill and knowledge, Resident Evil became manageable, even comfortable. Speedrunners would eventually complete the game in under 90 minutes, having memorized every spawn point and optimization. The formula worked. Resident Evil 2 released in January 1998, expanding the concept to a full city and dual protagonists. Dino Crisis would follow in 1999, applying the same mechanics to dinosaurs instead of zombies. Other games borrowed liberally from Capcom's blueprint. The convention seemed set in stone. Survival horror meant limited resources, constant danger, pre-rendered environments, and creatures you could learn to fight efficiently. Into this established genre walked Konami, a company better known for action games like Metal Gear Solid and arcade classics like Castlevania. They wanted their own survival horror franchise, something that could compete with Resident Evil's commercial success. But the team they assembled, a group of developers who would come to be called Team Silent, had different ideas about what horror could be. September 1996, the beginning. Development on what would become Silent Hill began in September 1996, just months after the original Resident Evil's massive success. Konami's goals were straightforward and profit-driven. Create a game that would succeed in the American market by following the Resident Evil formula. The higher-ups at Konami wanted a Hollywood-style atmosphere, commercial appeal, and a product that could challenge Capcom's dominance in this emerging genre. The team assembled for this project was, by most accounts, an odd collection of developers. According to composer Akira Yamaoka, many members of Team Silent felt like outsiders within Konami. Some had worked on projects that hadn't met expectations. They weren't the company's star developers. Management's faith in the project was limited, and as development progressed, that faith only diminished further. The paradox was that this lack of confidence from above granted the team unexpected freedom. Because Konami wasn't heavily invested in the project's success, and because games were still relatively low budget compared to later generations, Team Silent had room to experiment, to ignore the original mandate, and to create something that felt personal rather than commercial. Keiichiro Toyama, who would serve as director, had never directed a game before. Konami's decision to appoint him bewildered even Toyama himself. He wasn't a horror film aficionado with an encyclopedic knowledge of the genre's conventions. Instead, his interests ran toward UFOS, the occult, and the surreal cinema of David Lynch. These influences would prove crucial. Rather than trying to recreate the biological horror of Resident Evil, Toyama steered the project towards something more psychological, more ambiguous, more concerned with atmosphere than jump scares. The scenario for Silent Hill came from Toyama directly. The story he crafted was deliberately vague and occasionally contradictory, designed to leave players uncertain about what was real and what wasn't. The goal wasn't to provide clear answers, but to create unease through mystery. This ran counter to traditional game design wisdom, which held that players needed to understand the rules of the world they inhabited. Silent Hill would instead embrace confusion as a design principle, making players work to piece together meaning from fragments that didn't always fit together cleanly. The team drew inspiration from Western literature and films, creating their interpretation of a small American town filtered through Japanese imagination. They looked at European and Russian depictions of America as well, creating something that felt authentically foreign, a town that existed in a slightly warped space, not quite matching any real American location but feeling plausibly American to players unfamiliar with the country's actual geography and culture. This uncanny valley approach to setting would prove remarkably effective. Silent Hill feels real enough to be recognizable, but wrong enough to be deeply unsettling. The technical limitations that became artistic strengths. The PlayStation hardware in 1999 had strict limitations. The console could render polygons in real time, unlike the pre-rendered backgrounds of Resident Evil, but it couldn't handle much complexity at once without the frame rate collapsing. The draw distance, how far into the environment the hardware could render objects, was particularly limited. Games solved this problem in various ways. Many used tight indoor environments that naturally limited what needed to be on screen. Metal Gear Solid kept most action in corridors and small rooms. Resident Evil solved the problem by using pre-rendered backgrounds that weren't actually being calculated in real time. Team Silent wanted to create outdoor environments, streets, and open spaces that felt like an actual town. This presented a problem. How do you render a town when the hardware can barely show more than a block at a time? The solution they landed on was simple but transformative. Cover everything in fog. Dense, thick fog that reduced visibility to about 20 feet in any direction. Buildings beyond that range simply didn't need to exist yet. The fog hid their absence. Assets could load and unload dynamically as the player moved, keeping memory usage manageable and performance stable. This was born from technical necessity, but the team quickly recognized what they'd accidentally created. The fog didn't just hide hardware limitations, it transformed the emotional experience of navigating the game. In Resident Evil, you moved through clearly defined rooms with visible walls and obvious exits. Each space was discrete and comprehensible. In Silent Hill, you moved through continuous streets where landmarks emerged from nothingness and disappeared behind you. Every intersection became a decision point without clear information about what lay in any direction. The player had to trust forward movement into uncertainty, and uncertainty generates its own category of dread that doesn't require any immediate threat. The fog also tapped into something primal about human psychology. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, constantly scanning our environment for meaningful information. When visual data is obscured, our minds fill in the gaps, often with threat. We see movement that isn't there, shadows that resolve into nothing, faces and random patterns. Silent Hill weaponized this tendency. Players reported seeing things in the fog that the game never actually rendered, their minds supplying horrors more effective than anything the PlayStation's limited polygon count could have created. Streets you'd walked before felt different when approached from a new direction. The fog made spatial relationships uncertain. Was that building the same one you'd seen before, or something new? The radio crackling with static told you something hostile was nearby, but in the fog, you often couldn't see it until it was much too close. This created a specific flavor of anxiety, not the immediate threat of something lunging from around a corner, but the creeping awareness that danger could be anywhere within that white void, and you wouldn't know until it was already upon you. The darkness served a similar purpose. Many areas required Harry's flashlight to navigate, creating a cone of visibility in otherwise impenetrable black. The decision to keep the flashlight as a toggle rather than always on gave players a choice that felt meaningful. Do you sacrifice visibility for the chance that enemies might not notice you as easily? The game never explicitly told you whether the flashlight actually affected enemy behavior, creating uncertainty that was more effective than any concrete mechanic could have been. When Team Silent moved to more powerful hardware for later entries, they could have eliminated the fog entirely. Silent Hill 2 on PlayStation 2 had significantly more processing power. Silent Hill 3 could have rendered entire streets clearly, but they kept the fog because it had become synonymous with the series' identity. What began as a workaround for hardware limitations had become an aesthetic choice, a mood-setting tool that defined the franchise. Even the 2024 remake of Silent Hill 2 by Bloober Team retained the fog, understanding that it was essential to the series' emotional core rather than a technical artifact to be discarded. A sound design philosophy. Akira Yamaoka joined the Silent Hill project after the original composer left. He requested to be part of the team specifically because he saw an opportunity to do something different with game audio. His philosophy, stated in various interviews over the years, was simple and revolutionary. The lack of sound impresses people more than beautiful music. Silence, in Yamaoka's framework, was a weapon. This ran counter to prevailing wisdom about game audio. Most games of the era filled every moment with sound. Resident Evil had constant ambient loops in every room, the mansion's ominous drone, the police station's alert siren, the laboratory's mechanical hum. Every space had audio presence. Even other horror games maintained constant sonic atmospheres. Clock Tower had its haunting music box theme. The assumption was that silence suggested technical failure, that emptiness needed filling. Yamaoka embraced quiet. Long stretches of Silent Hill gameplay pass with only footsteps, the creak of doors, distant water dripping. The game allows you to exist in near silence, which makes you hyper-aware of every sound that does occur. When a window breaks in Cafe 5-2 near the game's opening, it's shocking not because the sound effect itself is particularly loud, but because it punctures minutes of silence. When you've been walking fog-covered streets for 5 minutes hearing nothing but the scrape of your own feet on pavement, any sudden sound becomes violence against your ears. The radio mechanic worked perfectly within this philosophy. Harry's pocket radio emits harsh static when enemies are nearby, functioning as a proximity alarm. In the silence, that sudden static burst hits hard. The radio crackles, your heart rate spikes, and you stop moving, scanning the fog for whatever triggered the warning. But Yamaoka understood that the radio couldn't be constant. If it were always on, always crackling, players would tune it out the way we unconsciously ignore white noise. Instead, quiet stretches are interrupted by the radio's warning, creating a rhythm: silence, alarm, potential combat, resolution, silence again. The dynamic range, from complete quiet to static to the sounds of combat, created more tension than constant audio presence ever could. When music does appear in Silent Hill, it's often diegetic or deeply atmospheric. The save points are marked by a specific, melancholic melody, a music box tone that's gentle and sad. This becomes Pavlovian comfort, a signal that you're safe, that threat has paused. Certain locations have unsettling, ambient tracks that blur the line between music and sound design. Is that a musical note or a machine sound? Is that melody or just industrial noise? The ambiguity itself becomes unsettling. Yamaoka drew heavily from industrial music, artists like Nine Inch Nails, Coil, and Throbbing Gristle. Industrial music uses found sounds, machine noise, distortion, and harsh textures rather than traditional instrumentation. Yamaoka brought this aesthetic to game audio, creating soundscapes that felt mechanical, broken, oppressive. A track called Killed by Death features what sounds like medical equipment, heartbeat monitors, and industrial percussion. My Heaven uses children's voices processed into something uncanny. These tracks are used sparingly, layered under or between gameplay sequences, never overwhelming the experience. The Otherworld sections intensify the audio approach. When Silent Hill shifts from foggy streets to its nightmare state, rusted metal, chain link fences, blood everywhere, the audio shifts with it. Industrial clangs, metallic scrapes, distant screams that might be wind through broken infrastructure. Yamaoka deliberately placed sounds ahead of visual cues so you'd hear something wrong before you'd see it. This triggers imagination, which horror understands is always more effective than explicit presentation. The sound of something dragging across metal grating becomes more frightening than actually seeing what's being dragged. Boss encounters break the silence more dramatically, but not with orchestral bombast. The split head fight in the school boiler room features percussive, grinding music that sounds like machinery tearing itself apart. It's hostile music, aggressive without being epic. You're not meant to feel pumped up for battle. You're meant to feel like the environment itself wants you gone. The music doesn't encourage, it pressures. It's claustrophobic and oppressive, matching the tight arena and the horror of the creature itself. When Yamaoka presented his work to the rest of Team Silent for the first time, they thought there was a bug in the game. The harsh industrial noise, the jarring transitions, the use of silence. None of it matched what game music was supposed to sound like. Yamaoka had to explain that the noise was intentional, that this style was deliberate, and only after elaborating on his reasoning did the team understand what he was trying to achieve. The fact that experienced game developers initially mistook his composition for a technical error speaks to how radical his approach was. The Silent Hill Original Soundtracks album released in Japan on March 5th, 1999, just days after the game's Japanese launch. The album revealed something important about Yamaoka's work. The music was good enough to stand alone, separate from the game. This wasn't just functional game audio, but genuine composition that could be appreciated independently. The ending theme, Esperandote, composed by Rika Muranaka, was a tango featuring bandoneons, violins, and Spanish lyrics. The story of its creation, Muranaka arriving in Buenos Aires to record the song and discovering the translated lyrics no longer matched the melody, forcing her to recompose it in 5 minutes, added to the game's mythology. This audio philosophy influenced countless games afterward. Fatal Frame used silence and sudden audio stings to great effect. Condemned emphasized environmental audio over musical score. Dead Space studied Yamaoka's work extensively, but few achieved the balance he found, where music was rare enough to be meaningful and silence was long enough to create genuine unease. Later, Silent Hill games benefited from Yamaoka's continued involvement, with Silent Hill 2's soundtrack becoming legendary for tracks like Theme of Laura and Promise, achingly melodic pieces that were beautiful and tragic, incorporating guitar work layered over industrial foundations. When Yamaoka left Konami in 2009, fans worried the series would lose its soul, which tells you how central his approach had become to Silent Hill's identity. Harry Mason, The Ordinary Man, every choice Team Silent made pointed toward the same goal: create horror through vulnerability rather than power fantasy. This extended to the protagonist. Resident Evil's Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine were members of STARS, an elite police unit. They had military training, weapons expertise, and physical capabilities that made them formidable. The challenge came from overwhelming odds and limited resources, not from personal incompetence. Players could become skilled at combat, mastering perfect headshot angles and optimal resource usage. Harry Mason is a writer, an ordinary man in his 30s who's lost his wife Jody to illness 4 years earlier and is raising his adopted daughter Cheryl alone. He's not trained for violence, not particularly athletic, not prepared for horror. The game makes you feel this in every encounter. When Harry swings a steel pipe, the animation is hesitant and unpracticed. There's wind-up before impact, recovery afterward. His aim with firearms is unsteady. Even when you line up a shot perfectly, Harry's in-universe accuracy introduces variance. The reticule wavers, shots that should connect miss. He moves like someone uncomfortable with violence because he is. This was deliberately designed to maintain vulnerability as a central experience. Traditional game design holds that players should feel competent, should improve mechanically over time, should be rewarded for skill mastery. Games are about agency, power, growth. You start weak and become strong. Silent Hill rejected this entirely. You start vulnerable and remain vulnerable. You never get good at fighting in any comfortable way. Even on repeated playthroughs with unlocked weapons like the Hyper Blaster or Rock Drill, the baseline combat remains clumsy because Harry remains Harry, an unprepared civilian thrust into nightmare circumstances. The enemies reflect this design choice. The groaners, dog-like creatures, don't follow predictable patterns the way Resident Evil's zombies do. They circle, feint, break into sudden rushes from angles that change between encounters. Air screamers glide overhead and dive unpredictably. The game doesn't want you to learn a strategy and execute it cleanly. It wants you to feel that moment when your planned response falls apart and you're swinging wildly, hoping to connect before the creature's next attack. This creates a fundamentally different psychological experience than Resident Evil's resource tension. In Capcom's games, you know you can kill the zombie cleanly if you execute properly. The tension is whether you should spend the ammunition. In Silent Hill, you're not certain you can kill the groaner even if you commit to the attempt. Will your swings connect? Will it dodge? How much damage will you take in the exchange? Combat itself is uncertain, which generates a different flavor of dread. The question isn't just, do I have enough resources, but can I actually succeed if I try? Health items are scarce enough that trading damage for kills feels expensive. Ammunition is limited enough that emptying a clip into a single groaner seems wasteful, but attempting melee often means taking multiple hits. The game creates situations where the best choice is often avoidance, but it never tutorializes this explicitly. Players trained on other survival horror games would try to clear rooms, try to master combat, and find themselves constantly low on supplies and frustrated with the clumsy mechanics. This frustration was, perversely, part of the design. The game wanted you to feel Harry's inadequacy, wanted you to question whether fighting was worthwhile, wanted you to approach every encounter with dread rather than confidence. Harry's characterization extends beyond just combat mechanics. In cutscenes, he handles weapons like objects he's unsure about, not tools he's eager to use. When he picks up the handgun for the first time, there's no sense of empowerment, no moment where the player feels more capable. It's just another burden, another responsibility in a situation he's completely unprepared for. His voice acting, much maligned in reviews at the time but perfectly appropriate in retrospect, conveys exhaustion and confusion rather than action hero determination. When Harry speaks to other characters, he sounds like someone trying to maintain composure while nothing makes sense, which is exactly what he should sound like. The game reinforces Harry's ordinary status through small details. After sprinting, he gasps for breath, hands on knees, unable to continue immediately. The controller vibration mimics his heartbeat, beating faster when health is low. These aren't mechanical abstractions. They're reminders that you're controlling someone whose body has limits. Compare this to action game protagonists who can sprint indefinitely, who reload instantly, who treat violence as natural extension of movement. Harry treats violence as something painful and difficult because for him it is. Silent Hill 2 would perfect this approach. James Sunderland's combat animations are even more exhausted than Harry's. He swings weapons with the energy of someone who doesn't care if he gets hurt because emotionally he doesn't. His shots are desperate, his melees heavy and slow. Playing as James feels like wading through deep water where every action requires effort. This isn't technical limitation, it's characterization through gameplay, telling you who James is through how he moves and fights. The rule being broken here is fundamental to game design. Games should make you feel powerful, or at least competent. This is why people play games, to be effective in ways we aren't in life, to master systems, to grow in capability. Silent Hill makes you feel uncertain and ill-equipped, discovering that this is its own kind of engagement. You're not playing to master a system, you're playing to survive situations you're not prepared for, and the lack of preparation is the point. That shift in expectation was radical in 1999 and remains unusual even now. The story, Descent into Personal Hell. Silent Hill opens with a flashback. Harry and Jody Mason find an abandoned baby in a casket by the side of a road. The scene then shifts to years later. Harry driving to Silent Hill with his adopted daughter Cheryl for a vacation. She's 7 years old now, and Harry has been alone raising her since Jody died of illness 4 years ago. The drive is meant to be healing, a brief escape from grief into a quiet resort town with scenic views. On the outskirts of town, Harry notices a police motorcycle lying crashed on the road. Officer Sybil Bennett's bike, though he doesn't know that yet. Then a figure appears in the middle of the road, a young girl in a blue school uniform. Harry swerves to avoid her, crashes and loses consciousness. When he wakes, Cheryl is gone. The passenger door hangs open. Snow is falling despite it being late September. The town is covered in fog so thick he can barely see 20 feet ahead, and when he calls Cheryl's name, only echoes answer. The initial search leads Harry deeper into impossibility. He follows what he thinks is Cheryl through fog-shrouded streets into an alley. The environment darkens suddenly, reality peeling away to reveal something underneath. Metal grating for ground, chain link fences for walls, everything rusted and bleeding. Air raid sirens wail. Creatures emerge from the darkness, shambling things that should not exist. Harry, unarmed, runs deeper into the alley until he's cornered by a dead end, and the screen fades to black as the monsters close in. He wakes in Cafe 5 to 2, somehow alive, somehow returned to the fog world rather than the nightmare realm. Officer Sybil Bennett finds him and provides both a weapon, a handgun, and information about the radio. She's investigating what's happened to Silent Hill herself, unable to find anyone else, unable to leave, and she needs backup that isn't coming. Before she departs to search for help, she gives Harry a chance to survive whatever is happening here. The structure of the story reveals itself gradually through Harry's navigation of key locations. Midwich Elementary School, where he encounters cult symbols and references to a girl named Alessa. Alchemilla Hospital, where he meets Dr. Michael Kaufman, the hospital's director, bewildered and suspicious, and Lisa Garland, a nurse who seems trapped in a loop of awareness about her own unreality. The otherworld transitions become regular events, announced by air raid sirens, transforming locations from merely unsettling to actively hostile. Dahlia Gillespie appears periodically, a woman who presents herself as a concerned citizen, but clearly knows far more than she's willing to explain directly. She gives Harry the Floros, claiming it will help combat the darkness spreading through town. She warns him about the mark of Samael appearing in various locations, claiming these symbols herald catastrophe. What she doesn't tell Harry, what players only discover through careful attention and multiple playthroughs, is that she's lying about almost everything. The symbols aren't the mark of Samael at all, but the seal of Metatron, a protective force Dahlia wants destroyed. She's manipulating Harry into serving her goals while he believes he's preventing disaster. The truth, assembled from fragments scattered across the game, is darker than any single cutscene explains. Alessa Gillespie was Dahlia's daughter, a child with powerful psychic abilities. Dahlia belonged to a cult called the Order, which sought to birth a god through a human vessel. 7 years before the game's events, Dahlia used Alessa in a ritual that involved immolating the child, burning her alive to trigger the deity's birth. The ritual failed catastrophically. Alessa, in agony and resistance, split her soul in two. Half remained trapped in her burned body, kept alive through unnatural means in the hospital's basement. The other half escaped, manifesting as an infant that Harry and Jody found by the roadside, the baby they adopted and named Cheryl. For 7 years, Alessa's suffering has warped reality around Silent Hill. Her nightmare has bled into the town, creating the other world that manifests alongside the fog world. The monsters are manifestations of her trauma and pain. The cult has been waiting for an opportunity to complete the ritual, and when Cheryl, Alessa's other half, returns to Silent Hill with Harry, Dahlia seizes the chance. She manipulates Harry into weakening the protective seals Alessa has been maintaining, then orchestrates Cheryl's kidnapping to force the two halves of Alessa's soul to reunite. The climax occurs in the Nowhere, a location that exists beyond the town's geography, a space made entirely from Alessa's psychic projection. Harry confronts Dahlia, who reveals her manipulations. Sybil, if you've saved her, appears to help. Kaufman appears with a vial of Aglaophotis, a red liquid with the power to expel supernatural parasites, and throws it at the combined Alessa Cheryl form now called the Incubator. The god seed is expelled, manifesting as the incubus, which immediately kills Dahlia before turning on Harry. The battle that follows determines everything. Harry fights what is essentially a newborn deity, malformed and monstrous, born from 7 years of a child's suffering. Whether he defeats it depends on actions taken throughout the game. Whether you saved Sybil, whether you helped Kaufman, whether you maintained certain health thresholds. The good endings show Harry receiving a baby from the dying incubator, Alessa reborn, purified of the god seed and the trauma given to Harry as an act of gratitude. He escapes with Sybil as the other world collapses. In the bad endings, variations occur. Sometimes Harry dies, sometimes he escapes alone, sometimes the resolution is less hopeful. The UFO ending, unlocked through specific item collection, reveals the entire game as an alien abduction plot. It's pure comedy, a deliberate pressure valve that lets players laugh after hours of tension. This kind of joke ending would become a series tradition. Proof that Team Silent took their work seriously, but not so seriously they couldn't mock themselves. What makes Silent Hill's story effective isn't the plot itself. Cult tries to birth God through child sacrifice isn't particularly original. What works is how the game tells this story. Information comes fragmented through environment details, brief conversations, notes that contradict each other, and visual storytelling that requires interpretation. The game trusts players to piece together meaning without exposition dumps. Many players completed Silent Hill without fully understanding what happened to Alessa or why Dahlia manipulated them. The confusion was intentional, maintaining the sense that you're stumbling through something larger and more complex than you can fully grasp. This narrative approach influenced how later games told stories. Silent Hill 2 would take ambiguity even further, making the entire journey a psychological experience where every element reflected James Sunderland's guilt and repression. Silent Hill 3 would provide more explicit narrative while maintaining the series' commitment to environmental storytelling. The first game established that horror stories don't need to explain everything, that confusion and uncertainty can be more effective than clarity, that letting players fill in gaps with their imagination creates deeper engagement than spelling out every detail. The other world, reality's darker twin. The air raid siren sounds, the world transforms. Streets of the fog world, unsettling but navigable, give way to nightmare. Metal grating replaces pavement. Chain link fences appear where walls stood. Blood stains everything. Ambient industrial noise fills the air that moments before was silent. This is the other world, Silent Hill's most distinctive structural element, and understanding what it represents has generated debate since 1999. The most straightforward reading, the other world is Silent Hill's true nature revealed. The fog world is denial, perception dulled. The other world is reality without filters, horror beneath normalcy exposed. When you navigate fog-shrouded streets, you're seeing Silent Hill as it presents itself, empty, quiet, sad. When you're in the other world, you're seeing what it actually is, hostile, industrial, bleeding. But the mythology goes deeper. Official materials from Team Silent, particularly the Book of Lost Memories Supplemental Guide, tie the other world specifically to Alessa Gillespie, her pain from the ritual fire, her years in a coma, her suffering in hospitals, all of this warped reality around her. The other world is her nightmare made physical, leaking into the town and transforming spaces according to her trauma. This explains the aesthetic. Why industrial? Why hospitals and prisons and factories? Because these evoke the settings of Alessa's experience. She was in hospitals. She felt trapped and controlled. The Order treated her body as a vessel, not a person. so the world becomes rusty metal and grating you can see through, and chain link cages and industrial fixtures that evoke both medical equipment and factory processing. Everything institutional, mechanical, dehumanizing. Art director Masahiro Ito discussed the visual influences in interviews. Francis Bacon paintings with their distorted figures and oppressive spaces, industrial photography, medical equipment. The PlayStation's technical limitations shaped some choices. Wire mesh ceilings were easier to render than solid geometry, but the effect worked so well they became intentional. The other world isn't gothic like Resident Evil's mansion. It's not aristocratic decay. It's industrial, modern in a wrong way, mechanical. Not the horror of the past, but the horror of systems, institutions, machinery. This reflects late 20th century anxieties. Not haunted castles, but hospitals. Not monsters from nature, but industrial accidents. Not wilderness, but infrastructure. The transformation itself is horrifying. Sometimes announced by sirens, sometimes not. You might walk through a door and the world is changed. You might look away briefly and look back to find everything different. The unpredictability removes control. You can't prepare for the shift. It happens when the game decides. This breaks player agency in ways that feel uncomfortable in interactive media. Games are about control, about input and response. Silent Hill takes control away at these moments, forces you to watch the transformation, puts you in a hostile environment you didn't choose to enter. The return to the fog world creates relief without safety. When you complete the other world's objective, defeat the boss, solve the puzzle, survive the gauntlet, and reality shifts back to fog, you're not in a safe space. You're still in Silent Hill, still surrounded by threats, but the relative safety feels like a gift. The game teaches you to be grateful for the fog world, which was scary initially, but becomes comfortable compared to the other world's intensity. This emotional manipulation is clever. One level of horror becomes safe by introducing a worse level. Later games experimented with this concept. Silent Hill 3 featured more organic, fleshy otherworld sections that looked like the inside of a body. Silent Hill 4 trapped players in an apartment that slowly decayed, bringing otherworld aesthetics into the safe space. Silent Hill Origins added mirrors that let you transition between worlds at will, making the otherworld a tool rather than just a transformation. Each variation explored different possibilities of the same core idea. Reality has layers, and beneath the surface lies something terrible that occasionally bleeds through. The other world worked because it meant something beyond just being scarier. It was psychological reality made architectural, trauma given physical form, the horror beneath surfaces revealed. When done right, as in the first 3 games, the shift was profound. You're seeing truth now, and it's worse than you imagined. When done poorly, as in some Western developed entries, it became just the red, scary version of the level, superficial rather than meaningful. The cult and the mythology. Silent Hill's backstory involves the Order, a cult that has existed in the town for generations. Their theology is a disturbing fusion. Native American spiritual concepts filtered through Christian apocalypticism, seasoned with European occultism and generous helpings of self-serving prophecy. At the cult's core is a single obsessive goal: birth God. Not worship existing divinity, but literally create a new God through human vessels and ritual sacrifice. The Order's doctrine holds that paradise can be achieved through suffering, that a select few enlightened souls will transcend flesh through the proper application of pain and faith. To facilitate this, they've established seemingly benign institutions, orphanages, sanitariums, schools, where vulnerable individuals can be groomed, their traumas amplified and directed toward the Order's purposes. Wish House, orphanage, mentioned in later games, exemplifies this approach. Children with nowhere else to go find themselves in an environment that systematically breaks down their sense of self. They're taught that suffering is divine, that abandonment proved their special selection for higher purposes, that pain endured is holy purification. Dahlia Gillespie represents the Order's leadership, though the exact hierarchies remain deliberately unclear. She's a spiritualistic medium with genuine psychic abilities and fanatical devotion to the cult's goals. When she realizes her daughter Alessa possesses extraordinary power, Dahlia sees not a child to protect, but a vessel to exploit. The ritual that burns Alessa is Dahlia's attempt to impregnate her daughter with the god seed, to use Alessa's body as an incubator for divinity. That the ritual only partially succeeds, that Alessa resists, splits her soul, traps herself in limbo rather than complete the birth, is an obstacle to Dahlia, not a tragedy. For 7 years, she simply waits for another opportunity. The game introduces cult mythology through environmental details rather than exposition. The Mark of Samael appears in various locations, a circular sigil that Dahlia claims represents evil spreading through town. She convinces Harry to stop its completion, framing herself as an ally against darkness. Only later do players learn this is a lie. The symbols are actually the seal of Metatron, a protective emblem with the power to undo Dahlia's schemes. By calling it the Mark of Samael and framing it as dangerous, Dahlia tricks Harry into serving her goals while he believes he's preventing catastrophe. The names themselves carry weight. Samael, in real mystical texts, is often called the Angel of Death, sometimes equated with the serpent from Eden. Metatron is described in Jewish Apocrypha as a heavenly being seated beside God's throne, sometimes called the Lesser YHWH. By drawing on these real occult traditions, Silent Hill gives its fictional cult a resonance that pure invention couldn't achieve. The game isn't making everything up, it's remixing genuine mystical concepts into something new and disturbing. This approach to cult mythology influenced how games handled religious horror afterward. The idea that cults could blend real traditions into something grotesque, that familiar symbols could be twisted to serve dark purposes, that faith could be weaponized. These became common tropes in horror gaming. But Silent Hill's restraint made it effective. The game never fully explains the Order's theology, never gives you a comprehensive document outlining their beliefs. You piece together understanding from fragments, and the gaps in knowledge create more unease than complete information would. The ritual mechanics also matter. The Order believes God requires specific conditions: a vessel of sufficient psychic power, ritual preparation through suffering, proper alignment of spiritual forces within Silent Hill. These conditions prove difficult to manufacture, leading to decades of failed attempts and disappointed prophets. Children are assessed for potential, subjected to rituals meant to amplify abilities, discarded when they prove insufficient. The Order's hidden chambers hold evidence of these failures: ritual implements, documentation of unsuccessful ceremonies, occasional remains of those who didn't survive. Eglaophotis, the red liquid Kaufman uses in The Good Endings, represents a counterforce to the cult's plans. In real occult texts, Eglaophotis was associated with plants used to ward off evil spirits. Silent Hill appropriates this tradition, making the substance capable of expelling the god seed from Alessa. The fact that a single vial can destroy decades of cult planning exposes the fragility of their faith. They've surrounded themselves with symbols and rituals of control, but their god is vulnerable to a simple purging agent. That vulnerability suggests their entire theology might be built on nothing, that all the suffering they've inflicted was for a deity that can't even survive basic resistance. The Order's legacy extends beyond the first game. Silent Hill 3 deals directly with the cult's aftermath, featuring Claudia Wolf, Dahlia's successor in fanaticism, attempting another divine birth through Heather Mason. Silent Hill 4's Walter Sullivan operates according to his own twisted interpretation of cult doctrine, conducting 21 ritual murders. Later games reference the Order repeatedly, showing how their influence spread beyond Silent Hill proper into neighboring communities. The cult becomes the franchise's through line, the consistent element explaining why supernatural horror manifests in specific ways. The monsters, manifestations of inner darkness. The creatures Harry encounters aren't random obstacles. Each monster type serves specific symbolic purposes, though the game never explicitly states these meanings. The Grey Children, small figures carrying knives, appear in Midwich Elementary School. They're child-sized, hostile, pathetic. Why children specifically? Because the school is a site of childhood trauma, of innocence corrupted. These aren't literal children, but manifestations of what the Order has done to children, of Alessa's memories of being bullied and called a witch by classmates. The Groaners, dog-like creatures that serve as standard enemies in streets, suggest feral violence and base instinct. The Air Screamers, pterodactyl-esque things that glide and dive, represent threats from above, attacks you can't predict or avoid, terror that swoops down when you thought you were safe. The design isn't about creating cool monsters for marketing purposes. It's about generating specific emotional responses tied to the themes. In the hospital, parasites control nurses, suggesting medical trauma, loss of bodily autonomy, the horror of caregivers who can't actually help. The twin feeler in Central Silent Hill is a massive larvae-like creature representing something premature and unformed, trying to birth itself into reality. The split head in the school's boiler room opens like a flower of meat and teeth, its design evoking both biological horror and the mechanical processing of institutional violence. This symbolic approach to monster design would reach its peak in Silent Hill 2, where every creature James encounters reflects his specific psychology. The lying figures, bound in their own flesh, represent repression. The mannequins, all legs and sexuality, represent objectification and frustration. Pyramid Head is punishment personified. The abstract daddy represents sexual trauma, literalizing childhood abuse in a way that's disturbing without being gratuitous. Team Silent walked a razor's edge with these designs, representing serious themes through monster imagery in ways that respected the severity of what was being depicted. Silent Hill established that horror game enemies could mean something beyond being obstacles to overcome. They could tell you about the protagonist's mental state, about the themes being explored, about the nature of the horror itself. This influenced numerous subsequent games. The creatures in games like Spec Ops, The Line, Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, and even Dark Souls use enemy design to communicate meaning rather than just challenge. The idea that you could read a game's themes through its bestiary started here. The design restraint also mattered. The PlayStation's limitations meant creatures couldn't be too detailed or complex. This forced Team Silent to work with suggestion rather than explicit gore. The Groaners are unsettling partly because you can't quite see them clearly in the fog. The nurses twitch and jerk in ways that suggest wrongness without showing everything. Later games with better hardware could render creatures in perfect detail, but often found that explicit clarity reduced fear. The imagination filling in gaps creates more effective horror than rendering every anatomical detail. Reception and legacy. Silent Hill released in North America on January 31st, 1999, though some sources cite February 23rd as the official release date. Japan received the game on March 4th, 1999, with European territories following in August. Initial reviews were generally positive, but often framed the game as Konami's answer to Resident Evil or a Resident Evil clone. GamePro's review called it shameless but slick, acknowledging the similarities while recognizing something different was happening with the horror itself. Edge described it as a near-perfect sim nightmare, closer to understanding what Team Silent had achieved. The common criticism focused on voice acting quality and combat controls. Critics noted that dialogue felt stilted, that actors paused oddly between lines, that the English localization wasn't smooth. In retrospect, these flaws actually serve the game's disorienting atmosphere. The slightly off dialogue makes every conversation feel wrong, maintaining unease even in moments of relative safety. Harry's clumsy combat, criticized as poor game feel, was intentional design to maintain vulnerability, but reviewers in 1999, trained on games that rewarded skill mastery, saw it as a failure rather than a feature. Despite mixed initial critical reception, Silent Hill found its audience. The game sold over 2 million copies worldwide, earning a spot in PlayStation's Greatest Hits budget line in North America. In Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, it received gold certification from the Verband der Unterhaltungssoftware Deutschland in November 1999, indicating sales of at least 100,000 units in those territories. These were strong numbers, proving commercial viability for this type of horror, even if Silent Hill didn't match Resident Evil's blockbuster status. The game's Metacritic score of 86 reflected genuine critical respect, even if some reviews were qualified. More importantly, player word of mouth was extraordinary. Silent Hill became the game people told their friends about, the horror experience that got under your skin in ways Resident Evil didn't. It was the game you played late at night with the lights off, the one that made you pause and collect yourself between play sessions. The fog, the radio static, Akira Yamaoka's industrial soundtrack. These elements stuck with players long after they completed the game. The impact on the horror genre was immediate and lasting. Fatal Frame, released in 2001, clearly drew from Silent Hill's playbook. An ordinary protagonist, vulnerability as core experience, Japanese folklore mixed with psychological horror, and heavy emphasis on atmosphere over action. Clock Tower 3, Haunting Ground, and Rule of Rose followed similar templates. Even Resident Evil itself changed after Silent Hill, with Resident Evil 4 in 2005 moving toward a more atmospheric, less campy approach to horror. The franchise Silent Hill spawned became one of gaming's most important horror series, though its quality would vary dramatically. Silent Hill 2 in 2001 is considered by many to be not just the best Silent Hill game, but one of the greatest games ever made. Perfecting the psychological horror approach the first game pioneered. Silent Hill 3 in 2003 continued the original game's story, bringing closure to Alessa's arc while being the scariest entry in the series according to many fans. Silent Hill 4, The Room in 2004, Team Silent's final entry, was experimental and divisive, but showed the team willing to take risks. After Team Silent disbanded, Western developers took over the series with mixed results. Silent Hill, Origins, Homecoming, Downpour, and Shattered Memories all had their advocates, but generally failed to capture what made the original games special. The 2006 film adaptation by Christophe Gans was financially successful and praised by fans for its visuals, even if critics were less kind. The franchise's reputation suffered through the 2010s as Konami's priorities shifted away from premium game development entirely. The 2024 announcement of a Silent Hill 2 remake by Bloober Team, following their successful work on other horror titles, reignited interest in the franchise. The remake proved commercially and critically successful, demonstrating that Silent Hill's design philosophy remained compelling 25 years after the original game. Players who'd never experienced the PlayStation era could now understand what the fog and industrial horror meant, what vulnerability-focused design achieved, what psychological horror could be when done with intelligence and restraint. Silent Hill's legacy extends beyond its own franchise. The game proved horror didn't need constant action or visceral gore. It showed that confusion and uncertainty could be design features rather than failures. It demonstrated that ordinary protagonists created more effective horror than super competent action heroes. It established that sound design, particularly the use of silence, was as important as any visual element. It pioneered environmental storytelling in ways that influenced not just horror, but game design generally. The game also showed that technical limitations could become artistic strengths. The fog wasn't just hiding polygon pop-in, it was creating atmosphere. The clunky combat wasn't just hardware restriction, it was vulnerability design. The ambiguous story wasn't just unclear writing, it was trusting players with interpretation. Team Silent took every constraint the PlayStation imposed and transformed it into something meaningful, proving that great design isn't about unlimited resources, but about understanding what serves the experience. The endings, multiple interpretations. Silent Hill features 5 possible endings determined by player actions throughout the game. Unlike many games with binary moral choice systems where the game explicitly asks you to choose good or evil, Silent Hill tracks behavior subtly and delivers an ending that reflects how you played without you necessarily realizing you were being judged. The good ending requires you to save Officer Sybil Bennett when she's possessed by a parasite in the amusement park. You need the Aglaophotis, obtained earlier by finding the key to the Indian Runner store and retrieving the liquid from the motorcycle gas tank, to expel the parasite rather than killing her. You also need to complete Michael Kaufman's side quest, ensuring he survives to the final confrontation. In this ending, Sybil attempts to shoot Dahlia but fails. Alessa and Cheryl merge into the incubator. Kaufman appears, throws Aglaophotis at the creature, and the God Seed emerges as the incubus, which immediately kills Dahlia. Harry defeats the incubus, and the incubator gives him a baby, Alessa reborn, purified, before showing him the escape route. Harry and Sybil flee as the other world collapses. Lisa Garland appears to drag Kaufman into the abyss, claiming him as payment for his complicity. The incubator uses her remaining power to stop the world's destruction long enough for Harry and Sybil to escape. The Good Plus ending differs only slightly. Everything proceeds as above, but Kaufman successfully escapes with Harry and Sybil rather than being claimed by Lisa. This version acknowledges that Kaufman, despite his moral failings, assisted in stopping the god's birth and earned survival as reward. The bad ending occurs if you don't save Sybil, either by not obtaining the Aglaophotis or by choosing not to use it, killing her instead. In this version, Kaufman doesn't appear to help. Harry faces the incubator directly without the Aglaophotis intervention. He fights and defeats the creature, but there's no rebirth, no purification. The ending shows Harry dying in the collapsing nightmare, his search for Cheryl ending in failure and death. It's bleak and hopeless, suggesting that sometimes the nightmare wins. The Bad Plus ending is similar, but shows Harry escaping alone after Sybil's death, leaving Silent Hill without his daughter. The escape is hollow, suggesting survival without resolution, a man who failed to save what he loved most. The UFO ending, unlocked after completing the game once and then collecting the channeling stone from various locations in a second playthrough, is pure comedy. Aliens arrive, abduct Harry and Kaufman via tractor beam, and the entire game is revealed as possibly an alien experiment or conspiracy. It's absurd, deliberately breaking the fourth wall and the game's serious tone. This kind of joke ending became a series tradition. Silent Hill 2's dog ending, Silent Hill 3's various silly unlockables. These pressure valves let players laugh after hours of tension, proving Team Silent understood that taking yourself too seriously risks becoming parody anyway. What makes these endings interesting isn't just the variations, but how they're determined. The game tracks whether you frequently check on Sybil when you encounter her, whether you explore thoroughly enough to find Kaufman's side quest, whether you maintain certain health thresholds. None of this is explicit. The game never tells you choosing to save Sybil will affect your ending. It just watches how you play and judges accordingly. This ending system influenced many subsequent games. The idea that games could track player behavior invisibly and deliver conclusions that reflected playstyle became more common. The Witcher series, Undertale, and Nier Automata all use variations of this approach. But in 1999, it was revolutionary to have a game that never explicitly presented moral choices, but still judge your morality through your actions. The ambiguity of which ending is canon has generated decades of debate. The bad endings clearly aren't canon because Heather Mason exists in Silent Hill 3, meaning Alessa must have been reborn and given to Harry. But is it the good or good plus ending that's canonical? Does Kaufman survive or does Lisa claim him? Team Silent never definitively answered this question, understanding that leaving it open preserved the game's ambiguous nature. A father's love, the emotional core. Beneath all the horror mechanics and cult mythology and psychological symbolism, Silent Hill is ultimately about a father searching for his daughter. Harry Mason's motivation is simple and completely human. Cheryl is missing, and he will not leave without her. Every decision, every risk, every moment of pushing forward into impossibility stems from this single driving need. The game never lets you question this. Harry's goal is crystal clear even as everything else becomes murky and uncertain. This emotional core distinguishes Silent Hill from Resident Evil's more plot-driven narrative. Chris and Jill are investigating a conspiracy, uncovering corporate malfeasance, dealing with broad threats to humanity. They're heroes in a traditional action sense. Harry is just a dad looking for his little girl. The scope is intimate, personal, focused. You're not saving the world. You're trying to save one child, and that specificity makes every moment feel more urgent. The game reinforces this through Harry's dialogue and reactions. When he meets other survivors, his questions always return to Cheryl. Have you seen a little girl? Where might she have gone? Is she safe? His desperation reads authentically because it's grounded in something universally understood, the parent's fear of losing a child. You don't need to have children yourself to understand why Harry refuses to give up, why he keeps moving forward even when nothing makes sense, why he'll fight monsters and trust suspicious strangers and walk into obvious traps if there's any chance Cheryl might be there. The revelation that Cheryl is actually half of Alessa's soul complicates this dynamic in interesting ways. Harry's love for Cheryl was genuine. He and Jody raised this child for 7 years, built their lives around her. The fact that she was created through mystical means rather than born naturally doesn't diminish that emotional reality. When Harry learns the truth about Cheryl's origins, it doesn't change his goal. She's still his daughter. He still needs to save her, or at least give her peace. The good endings provide emotional catharsis specifically because they acknowledge this love. When the incubator gives Harry the reborn baby, it's Alessa acknowledging that Harry's devotion was pure, that he earned this second chance at fatherhood. The image of Harry cradling the infant as the nightmare world collapses around him is powerful precisely because it represents hope emerging from horror. New life granted after everything seemed lost. It's a genuine happy ending in a genre that typically denies them. The bad endings work as tragedy specifically because they deny Harry what he's fought for. He came here for Cheryl. He endured the nightmare, fought the monsters, solved the puzzles, pushed through impossibility, and in the bad endings it doesn't matter. He loses anyway. Sometimes he dies, sometimes he escapes but leaves Cheryl behind. The failure hits hard because the goal was so pure and the effort was so genuine. There's no satisfaction in Harry's defeat, only sorrow. This emotional grounding influenced how later horror games approached their protagonists' motivations, making the goal personal rather than world-saving, making the horror intimate rather than apocalyptic, making the protagonist someone ordinary driven by love rather than duty. These choices create a deeper emotional investment. When games give you abstract missions to save humanity, failure feels like a game over screen. When games give you a daughter to save, failure feels like genuine loss. Harry Mason isn't the most complex protagonist in gaming. He doesn't have an elaborate backstory or hidden depths or character arc that transforms him. He starts the game as a father who loves his daughter, and he ends the game as a father who loves his daughter. The simplicity is the point. In the midst of all the psychological horror and cult conspiracies and reality warping nightmares, Harry's love for Cheryl is the one thing that remains clear and uncomplicated. It's the emotional anchor that keeps players grounded even as everything else becomes surreal and impossible. The retrospective view 25 years later. Looking back at Silent Hill from 2024, what's striking is how many of its innovations have become standard practice in horror gaming. The vulnerable protagonist is now expected. The emphasis on atmosphere over action is the norm in quality horror. Environmental storytelling is taught in game design courses. Multiple endings based on tracked behavior appear in countless titles. The use of industrial soundscapes and strategic silence has influenced countless composers. Even the fog, born from hardware limitations, has become such an iconic element that modern games, with no technical need for it, still employ fog to evoke Silent Hill's atmosphere. What hasn't been replicated as successfully is the balance Team Silent achieved. The game is clunky by modern standards, the tank controls feel archaic, the combat is genuinely frustrating at times, the voice acting ranges from adequate to unintentionally comical. But these elements work within the whole. The clunkiness maintains discomfort, the frustration serves vulnerability, the voice acting's slight wrongness keeps everything feeling off. When later games tried to copy Silent Hill, they often smoothed out these rough edges, making everything more polished and professional, and in doing so lost some of the original's power. The game also represents a specific moment in gaming history when mid-budget titles could be genuinely weird. Silent Hill wasn't a blockbuster production with massive marketing. It was a B-team project that Konami had limited faith in. That lack of corporate pressure allowed Team Silent to experiment, to make decisions that didn't make obvious commercial sense, to trust their instincts over market research. Today's gaming landscape, with its $100 million budgets and corporate committees, rarely allows for that kind of artistic freedom. The games that successfully capture Silent Hill's spirit, titles like Signalis, Lost in Vivo, or Crow Country, are usually independent projects working outside the mainstream industry structure. The franchise's troubled history after Team Silent's departure also provides a cautionary tale about corporate handling of artistic properties. When Konami handed development to Western studios without proper understanding of what made the series special, quality declined dramatically. When they prioritized pachinko machines and mobile games over premium development, they damaged the brand's reputation. When they canceled Silent Hills after the promising PT demo, they created a wound in the fan base that hasn't fully healed. The recent return with the Silent Hill 2 remake suggests Konami might finally understand the franchise's value, but the decade plus of mismanagement demonstrated how quickly corporate negligence can squander artistic legacy. For players encountering Silent Hill for the first time in 2024, the experience is complicated. The graphics are primitive by modern standards, low polygon models, blurry textures, the infamous PlayStation wobble, where vertices slightly shift. The controls feel stiff. The game's pace is slower than contemporary horror titles. But for those willing to engage with it on its own terms, Silent Hill remains powerfully effective. The fog still creates unease. The radio static still makes you stop and scan your surroundings. Akira Yamaoka's soundtrack still elevates every moment. The story still delivers emotional impact. The vulnerability design still generates genuine fear. The game also serves as a historical artifact, showing where modern horror gaming comes from. You could draw direct lines from Silent Hill to almost every major horror title of the past 2 decades. Resident Evil 7's first-person vulnerability, that's Silent Hill's influence. Outlast's defenseless protagonist, Silent Hill established that template. The Last of Us's environmental storytelling, Team Silent pioneered that approach. Alan Wake's use of light and darkness as core mechanics, they studied Silent Hill's fog extensively. Even non-horror games like Spec Ops, The Line, or Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice owe debts to how Silent Hill used gameplay to communicate psychological themes. Perhaps most importantly, Silent Hill proved that video games could be genuinely artistic while remaining commercially viable. This wasn't an art game made for a small audience. It was a commercial product that sold millions of copies, but it refused to compromise its vision to chase broader appeal. It trusted players to handle ambiguity, confusion, and discomfort. It believed horror could be about more than jump scares and monster closets. It demonstrated that technical limitations could become aesthetic choices. It showed that you could break every rule of conventional game design and still create something players would remember for decades. Conclusion: the fog that never lifts. Silent Hill arrived on January 31st, 1999, and 25 years later, we're still walking through its fog. The game team, Silent, created this strange, ambitious, deeply flawed, profoundly effective horror experience, established principles that define the genre today. It said vulnerability is more engaging than power. It said silence matters more than sound. It said uncertainty is scarier than explicit threat. It said ordinary people make better horror protagonists than trained professionals. It said technical limitations can become artistic strengths. It said games can tell stories through environment rather than exposition. It said ambiguity is acceptable, even preferable, to clear answers. Not everything about Silent Hill has aged gracefully. The combat remains clunky even when you understand it's intentional. The voice acting sounds stilted, even accounting for the uncanny atmosphere it creates. The graphics show every limitation of 1999 hardware. The pace feels slow to players conditioned on modern horror's relentless intensity. These are genuine flaws that can't be hand-waved away by claims of intentional design. But the core, the fog, and the radio static, and the industrial soundscape, and the vulnerable protagonist, and the environmental storytelling, and the psychological horror, and the father searching for his daughter remains powerful. The game still accomplishes what it set out to do: frighten you not through cheap shocks, but through sustained unease, through the feeling that something is wrong even when you can't see immediate danger, through the understanding that you're not prepared for what's happening, and probably never will be. The franchise that followed had its triumphs and failures. Silent Hill 2 perfected the psychological approach, creating what many consider the greatest horror game ever made. Silent Hill 3 continued the story with technical excellence and genuine scares. Silent Hill 4 experimented boldly, if not always successfully. The Western developed entries struggled to understand what made the series special. The 2006 film adaptation succeeded visually while missing the game's subtlety. The long dormancy after Silent Hill's cancellation felt like a franchise dying. The recent remake suggests possible revival, but also raises questions about whether recapturing lightning in a bottle is possible or even desirable. What can't be disputed is the original game's impact. Silent Hill changed horror gaming permanently. Every foggy street and every horror game since owes something to this PlayStation title from 1999. Every vulnerable protagonist stumbling through nightmare scenarios descends from Harry Mason. Every industrial soundtrack, full of metallic scrapes and distant echoes, references Akira Yamaoka's work. Every game that trusts environmental details to tell stories learned from Team Silent's approach. Every multiple ending system that tracks behavior invisibly was inspired by Silent Hill's judgment mechanics. For those who played it in 1999, Silent Hill represented something new and unsettling, proof that games could scare you without relying on action or gore, that horror could be cerebral and atmospheric. For those discovering it now, it's a historical artifact that shows where modern horror came from, what risks were taken, and what conventions were broken to get from Resident Evil's biological horror to today's psychological landscapes. For everyone, it's a reminder that sometimes the most impactful innovations come from limitations, from developers who didn't have unlimited resources or corporate backing, who had to make something work despite hardware constraints and limited budgets, who turned every restriction into an opportunity. The fog still hangs thick over Silent Hill's streets. The radio still crackles with static warning of threats you can't quite see. The air raid siren still announces reality's transformation into nightmare. And somewhere in that white void, a father still searches for his daughter, unwilling to give up no matter how impossible the situation becomes. 25 years after its release, Silent Hill remains what it always was: a game that understood fear, lives in uncertainty, that horror works best when it lets your imagination do the work, that sometimes the most frightening thing is not knowing what's waiting in the fog,